A labyrinth of rivers, canals, and rice paddies stretching across southern Vietnam. From the air, it looked peaceful, water glinting under the tropical sun, palm trees bending in the wind. But in the late 1960s, this place became one of the most dangerous battlefields on Earth. The war in Vietnam wasn't just fought in the jungles or the skies. It crept into the rivers, brown, slow, and deadly. Every bend, every muddy bank could hide an ambush. For the Viet Cong, the waterways were lifelines. Supplies, weapons, and fighters moved under the cover of night, blending with the endless streams of fishermen and farmers. The Americans quickly realised something chilling. Whoever controlled the rivers controlled the delta. At first, the US Navy wasn't built for this kind of war. It was a blue water force, meant to fight on oceans, not in narrow rivers choked with reeds. Massive carriers and destroyers were useless here. The Navy needed something different. Something smaller, faster, and meaner. In 1965, a new mission began taking shape. It was called Operation Game Warden. Its goal, to cut off the Viet Cong's river supply lines, patrol the Mekong's endless channels, and reclaim control from the shadows. The delta itself was unlike anything most American sailors had seen. Imagine a land that never stayed dry. Villages floated on rafts, markets drifted with the current, and roads disappeared into water during the monsoon. Even the ground moved, soft, wet, unstable. And yet, in this shifting world, entire armies hid and fought. When the first Navy patrols arrived, they used wooden junks and borrowed South Vietnamese craft. But the enemy knew the terrain far better. Viet Cong soldiers could vanish into the mangroves within seconds, their sampans disappearing under camouflage nets. Every ripple on the river could mean danger. The Navy's solution came in steel and fiberglass. Small patrol boats, or PBRS, were built specifically for this new kind of war. They were only 31 feet long, light enough to skim over shallow water, and fast enough to chase smugglers down narrow canals. Twin diesel engines roared behind armour plates. Twin 50 caliber machine guns bristled on the bow. They became the spearhead of the Brown Water Navy, a nickname that would stick forever. But speed wasn't enough. The Delta's rivers wound through territory that changed hands daily. American sailors could patrol a stretch of water in the morning and find it crawling with enemy fighters by afternoon. Mines were hidden in reeds. Tripwires stretched across canals. Floating explosives drifted silently with the current. One sailor later said, "The river didn't scare you until it went quiet." Then you knew something was waiting. By late 1966, the Game Warden force had grown. Dozens of PBRs were joined by larger gunboats, floating bases, and air support. The Navy's mobile riverine force set up in converted tank landing ships, creating floating command centres that could move with the tides. From above, Huey helicopters hovered low, scanning for ambushes. The war on the water was becoming a full-scale operation. For the men assigned here, it was a brutal and unpredictable life. Patrols lasted through the night. Mosquitoes filled the air thick enough to taste. The humidity was suffocating, and the smell, diesel, sweat, and rotting vegetation clung to everything. Sleep came in snatches, broken by gunfire echoing down the river. But the danger wasn't only from the enemy. The environment itself was hostile. Heat exhaustion, infections, and disease claimed almost as many men as bullets did. Boats broke down in the mud, engines clogged with debris. Radio signals faded in the thick canopy. Sometimes entire patrols vanished into the mist, their last transmission a burst of static and gunfire. Still, the sailors kept going. They called themselves river rats. Young men, most barely out of high school, steering through fog and darkness with one hand on the throttle and the other on a machine gun. They learned quickly. Every shadow could be a sniper, every fisherman could be a lookout. To survive, they adapted. They learned the river's moods, when it flowed slow and harmless, when it turned deadly. They memorised landmarks that changed with the tides. They painted their boats black to disappear at night. They stopped thinking like sailors and started thinking like hunters. Operation Game Warden wasn't about glory, it was about control, inch by inch, canal by canal. And even when the mission seemed impossible, the Navy refused to give up the Delta. By the end of 1966, the rivers had become battlefields. The Mekong, once a peaceful artery of life, now thundered with gunfire and explosions. American PBRS raced through the fog, chasing invisible enemies into the mangroves. Villages burned along the banks. and for the first time in its history, the US Navy had gone inland, not to sail the seas, but to fight in the heart of a swamp. The men of the brown water Navy were no longer just sailors. They were warriors of a new kind, waging a war where the horizon was made of reeds, not waves, and the rivers of Vietnam would never be the same again. It began with a problem no admiral had ever faced before. The US Navy, the most powerful fleet in the world, was losing control of puddles. Not oceans, not seas, but shallow, winding rivers in a faraway land called the Mekong Delta. Destroyers and carriers meant nothing here. The enemy moved in silence, hidden by mangrove roots and muddy water. By early 1966, Washington demanded answers. How could an army with helicopters, jets, and warships be outmaneuvered by men in wooden boats? The Pentagon's response was drastic. They would build a new kind of navy, one that could fight where no fleet had ever gone before. The idea became Operation Game Warden. Its mission was simple on paper: deny the Viet Cong use of the Delta's waterways. But the reality was anything but simple. The Delta had over 3,000 miles of rivers and canals, some barely wide enough for 2 boats to pass, others deep and treacherous, twisting like veins through rice paddies and jungles. To control this maze, the Navy needed men who could adapt fast, think fast, and fight faster. Volunteers poured in from across the fleet, sailors used to deep water and big ships. They would soon find themselves steering fiberglass boats through swamps, dodging sniper fire instead of torpedoes. Their training began in the United States, at a quiet base in California. The recruits learned how to drive patrol boat, river, the PBR. They practiced sharp turns in narrow channels, firing twin 50s from a rocking deck, repairing engines while under simulated attack. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no medals for patrolling a canal, but for those who volunteered, it was something new, a chance to fight where few dared to go. When the first PBRS arrived in Vietnam, they looked almost out of place, sleek, fast, and armed to the teeth. Each carried a crew of 4, a boat captain, an engineman, a gunner, and a seaman. They lived aboard for days at a time, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations under mosquito nets. Their job was to stop and search every vessel on the river, sampans, junks, even fishing boats. Anything could hide weapons or supplies for the Viet Cong. At first the locals watched them with silent curiosity. Then came the hostility. Night after night the rivers erupted with gunfire. Tracer rounds ripped through the dark. Rockets exploded against the banks. The Viet Cong knew every inch of the delta. They set ambushes with precision, planting mines in the water or hiding automatic weapons in floating markets. To the Americans it felt like the rivers were alive and angry. One sailor later said, "You never saw the enemy. You just saw the muzzle flashes and prayed your boat was still floating after." Game Warden patrols grew bolder. The Navy began working with Army helicopters, flying low along the canals to spot ambushes and direct gunfire. These airboats, nicknamed Seawolves, became legends, fast, loud, and fearless. They were the eyes of the river, always overhead when the shooting started. To support the patrols, the Navy created floating bases, massive ships anchored in the delta, stocked with fuel, ammunition, and living quarters. Sailors called them motherships. They became small cities in the middle of nowhere. PBRS tied up beside them each night for repairs and rest. The sound of engines never stopped. The smell of oil and diesel hung in the humid air. By late 1966, Task Force 116, the official title for the Brownwater Navy, was fully operational. Hundreds of men spread across the delta in rotating patrols. Every night they lit the rivers with tracer fire, chasing phantom enemies through the fog. Every day they inspected cargo, raided suspected supply routes, and escorted South Vietnamese troops through the canals. But it wasn't just about firepower. Winning hearts and minds mattered too. The sailors often carried food and medicine for local villagers, trying to show they weren't invaders, but protectors. Yet in the delta, trust was a fragile thing. One day a family would wave as the boats passed. The next, their hut would shelter enemy fighters. The Brownwater Navy wasn't glamorous. There were no headlines about their victories. But they made a difference, a quiet, grinding kind of difference. Every intercepted shipment meant fewer weapons reaching the Viet Cong. Every patrol forced the enemy to fight on ground, or water, not of their choosing. Still, the cost was high. Boats were torn apart by mines. Crews vanished into the night, their radios going silent mid-transmission, and every rescue attempt risked more lives. The men of Task Force 116 learned something the Navy had forgotten since the days of wooden ships: how to fight close, dirty, and unseen. They weren't just sailors anymore. They were river warriors, hunters of shadows. Operation Game Warden had done more than secure the rivers. It had changed the US Navy itself. The sea had always been its domain, but now it ruled something else: the thin brown veins of a country torn by war. And deep in those waters, where danger waited around every bend, the brown water navy began to earn its legend. The sailors fought not for glory, but for survival and each other. They built bonds that only men who shared the same boat and the same fear could understand. One gunner described it best: "Out there, the river was your world. It could kill you or it could save you, sometimes both in the same hour." By the end of 1967, the Navy had begun to turn the tide. Supply routes were choked off, Viet Cong traffic slowed. The Delta was no longer a free highway for the enemy, but the fighting never stopped. It only changed form: smaller, faster, deadlier. The rivers of Vietnam had become a chessboard of ambushes and counterattacks. The brown water navy controlled the channels, but the Viet Cong controlled the shadows. And somewhere in that murky, shifting space between them, the battle for the Delta raged on. The gunboats had proven their worth, but soon another kind of warrior would join them: silent, unseen, and lethal. The Navy SEALs were coming to the Delta. The Mekong Delta didn't look like a battlefield, not at first glance. The water shimmered like glass. Buffalo grazed along the banks. Children paddled to school in wooden canoes. But under that calm surface, death waited. Every canal, every clump of reeds could be a trap. By 1967, the brown water navy was in full swing. Hundreds of sailors patrolled the rivers day and night in their small, black-painted PBRS, patrol boats, river. They glided over the muddy current, engines rumbling, guns ready. Their orders were clear: stop the flow of weapons and fighters through the Delta. But the enemy was everywhere, and nowhere. The Viet Cong knew the terrain better than anyone. They lived in it, moved through it, vanished into it. They didn't need big ships or heavy weapons. Their boats were simple: sampans, dugouts, and small junks that could slip through the narrowest waterways. At night, they travelled in silence, hugging the banks, moving under the cover of trees. By dawn, they were gone, leaving no trace but ripples in the water. The Navy called these encounters contacts, short bursts of chaos that turned calm rivers into instant battle zones. A PBR might round a bend and see a flash of light, the spark of gunfire. The air would explode with sound. Bullets tore through the jungle, shattering the stillness. Gunners on the boats swung their twin 50s toward the muzzle flashes, unleashing a storm of lead that lit up the riverbank. The fight never lasted long. A few seconds, maybe a minute. Then silence again, smoke drifting across the water, the jungle hiding its secrets once more. For the crews, it was constant tension. They learned to read the signs: a sudden stop in bird calls, a boat too quiet, a villager looking away. The smallest detail could mean an ambush ahead. Many patrols ended before they began, the boats hit by hidden mines. Explosives buried in the mud, triggered by wire, or floated downstream disguised as logs. The Navy's enemy wasn't just the Viet Cong, it was the river itself. To fight back, the PBRS became floating fortresses. Each carried heavy machine guns at the bow and stern, grenade launchers in the middle, and flares for night illumination. The crews modified their boats endlessly: sandbags for armour, extra ammo belts wrapped around the gun mounts, makeshift shields welded from scrap metal. They knew that when the shooting started, those few seconds of protection could mean survival. Sometimes the enemy didn't even wait for nightfall. They struck broad daylight from huts, dikes, or tree lines, vanishing before the Navy could respond. Helicopters soon joined the fight, UH-1. Hueys, circling low to spot muzzle flashes and guide the boats through hostile zones. They became an extension of the fleet, eyes in the sky that could see through the smoke and confusion. The Americans called them Seawolves. They were the Navy's own helicopter gun squadrons, fast, fearless, and devastatingly accurate. When a patrol got pinned down, the Seawolves came roaring in, their miniguns cutting through the jungle like a buzzsaw. The sound alone was enough to scatter an ambush. But not every battle could be won from the air. On the rivers it was personal, face to face, boat to boat. One patrol might find a sampan loaded with rice. The next, a cache of rifles hidden beneath vegetables. The line between civilian and combatant blurred until no one could tell the difference. Sailors learned to search every vessel, every time, no matter how harmless it looked. The psychological toll was heavy. Every stop could be their last. Every friendly smile could hide an enemy. Many crews kept their emotions locked away. They joked, they cursed, they fought, and they moved on. There was no time to grieve, not out there. The Brownwater Navy didn't have front lines. The war could find you anywhere, in the middle of a sleepy village or in the pitch-black swamp at midnight. The Mekong wasn't just a battlefield, it was an ambush waiting to happen. Night in the Mekong Delta. The river lay still, black as oil. Crickets chirped in the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence again. A perfect night for ghosts to move. From the shadow of a PBR, a small rubber boat slipped quietly into the water. 4 figures paddled with slow, steady strokes. Faces painted black. Rifles wrapped in rags to muffle sound. They moved like part of the river itself. These were US Navy SEALs, men trained to fight where no one else could. Their mission was simple on paper: find the enemy, destroy his camps, disrupt his supply routes. But in the Mekong Delta, nothing was simple. The terrain was a nightmare: thick mangroves, knee-deep mud, and channels so narrow that even moonlight couldn't reach. Every sound carried for miles. Every movement risked discovery. By 1967, Operation Game Warden had brought control to the main rivers. But the enemy didn't fight on the main rivers anymore. The Viet Cong had melted into the swamps, the secret canals, the flooded forests, the hidden hamlets deep in the delta. To reach them, the Navy needed men who could move unseen, strike fast, and vanish before dawn. That's where the SEALs came in. They were the tip of the spear. Teams of just 6 to 8 men inserted by PBR or helicopter, often in total darkness. They operated far from friendly lines, relying only on their training and instincts. Every mission demanded silence. Every mistake could mean death. The SEALs didn't fight like soldiers. They hunted. They gathered intelligence, tracked movements, and struck without warning. Sometimes they crept through villages disguised as fishermen. Other times they waited in the mud for hours, watching enemy patrols pass only feet away. When the moment came, it was sudden and violent. Bursts of gunfire, explosions, and then silence again. Their weapons were as specialised as their tactics. M16 rifles, silenced pistols, stoner light machine guns, and claymore mines. Every pound mattered. Every tool had a purpose. They carried what they could, nothing more. When the fight began, they didn't call for backup. They were the backup. One SEAL recalled a mission near the Bassac River. His team slipped through flooded rice fields under the cover of night, guided only by the faint glow of starlight. The air was thick with mosquitoes. Their boots sank with every step. Then came the sound, a faint metallic click. A mine. The explosion tore the stillness apart. Within seconds the jungle erupted. Traces streaked through the dark. The team returned fire, crawling through mud, dragging a wounded man behind them. A PBR raced to their rescue, its machine guns hammering the riverbank. They made it out, barely. For the SEALs, barely was often the difference between life and death. But even in the chaos, they found rhythm, a strange understanding with the river. They learned to listen, to smell danger before seeing it. The Delta taught them patience. It punished hesitation. The Viet Cong feared them. They called them the men with green faces, for the camouflage paint they wore into battle. Stories spread through villages, stories of SEALs appearing from the water like spirits, striking camps and disappearing before dawn. For the enemy, they were unpredictable, almost supernatural. Each mission left its mark. The SEALs saw things most men couldn't imagine: villages caught in crossfire, civilians trapped between 2 wars, and friends lost to the mud and silence. But they kept going. They had to. Their operations gave the Navy eyes deep inside enemy territory. Every raid, every captured document, every radio intercepted brought the Americans a little closer to understanding the hidden war beneath the surface. When they weren't on missions, the SEALs lived aboard the same floating bases as the Brownwater Navy, old tank landing ships converted into mobile headquarters. Life on board was cramped, hot, and filled with noise. But for the SEALS, it was home. They cleaned weapons, planned raids, and waited for the next call. Sometimes it came without warning. A tip about an enemy supply dump, a suspected ambush site, a hidden bunker. Within minutes they'd be gone, blending into the night once more. Their success came at a cost. The missions were brutal, the exhaustion endless. But the impact was undeniable. The Viet Cong could no longer move freely through the Delta. Their safe zones were shrinking. Their supply lines, once invisible, were now hunted day and night. The Brownwater Navy gave America control of the rivers. The SEALS gave them control of the shadows. Together, they turned the Mekong Delta into a battlefield where even the dark was dangerous. And as the war dragged on, the Navy's new way of fighting, river, air, and swamp combined, would change how America waged war forever. Dawn over the Mekong Delta. The sky glowed orange, the mist lifting off the water. Beneath it, a pair of PBRS crept along the canal, engines low, crews tense. The jungle on both sides looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Then came the sound that froze every man in place, the sharp crack of a rifle, a single shot, then a dozen more. Gunfire exploded from the tree line. Bullets whipped across the water, striking the boats, sparking off metal. The sailors returned fire, their twin 50s thundering, traces slicing through the haze. But they were outnumbered, pinned between the banks. The radio operator yelled for help. Within minutes, the help arrived, from above. A pair of Navy Huey gunships roared over the treetops, their rotors chopping the air. They belonged to the HAL-3 Seawolves, the Navy's own helicopter squadron. The Seawolves dove straight into the fight, unleashing rockets and machine gun bursts that shredded the foliage. The river turned into a wall of noise and smoke. The ambush was broken in seconds. The PBRS was safe, for now. Scenes like this happened almost daily. By 1967, air power had become the Brownwater Navy's lifeline. The rivers were too narrow for heavy artillery and too isolated for quick reinforcements. Helicopters became the connection between the boats, the bases, and survival itself. The Seawolves were a breed apart. Their call sign came from the way they struck, fast, aggressive, and fearless. They flew UH-1. Huey stripped down and modified for combat. Twin miniguns mounted on the doors, rocket pods on the skids, armour plates bolted to the sides. Each helicopter carried a pilot, co-pilot, and 2 door gunners. Most were barely out of their 20s. Their missions were as unpredictable as the Delta itself. One moment they were escorting supply convoys, the next racing to rescue a downed crew or support a firefight along a canal. The radio never stopped buzzing. Distress calls, coordinates, bursts of static, and code words shouted through the chaos. The Seawolves answered them all. They lived on floating bases, the same as the river patrols. When an alarm sounded, the pilots sprinted from their bunks straight into the cockpit. Within minutes, they were airborne, engines screaming over the jungle canopy. There were no runways, no safe zones, just the endless patchwork of water and trees below. For the men on the rivers, the sound of rotor blades was the sweetest sound in Vietnam. It meant backup was coming. It meant they weren't alone. The teamwork between air and river patrols became seamless. PBRS would spot movement in the reeds, call it in, and within minutes, gunships were overhead. Seawolves fired flares to light up targets at night, raining down tracer fire that cut through the darkness. In turn, the boats guided the helicopters, marking enemy positions with smoke grenades. Together, they created a deadly rhythm, one that no Viet Cong ambush could match for long. But the danger went both ways. The helicopters were prime targets. Viet Cong gunners hid heavy machine guns under tree cover, waiting for the perfect shot. Many Seawolves never came back. Those who did often returned with bullet holes through their rotors, fuel lines, and armour plates. One pilot said, "If you landed without a few new holes, you weren't close enough to help." Still, they kept flying. Some missions lasted hours, the men soaked in sweat, gripping controls slick with oil. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. The door gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Down below, the river crews fought to stay alive. The coordination between air and water changed the entire nature of combat in the Delta. It was no longer just a naval war. It was a symphony of movement, boats, helicopters, and troops working as one. The Viet Cong never knew where the next strike would come from. The air patrols also brought something else: rescue. When a PBR hit a mine or took heavy fire, it was the Seawolves who came in, hovering inches above the water to pull survivors aboard. There was no time for hesitation. They landed in the middle of firefights, bullets ripping through the air, door gunners firing non-stop as wounded sailors were hauled into the cabin. Then they were gone, lifting off in seconds, leaving behind only the echo of rotor blades. Many of these rescues never made headlines. They were over before the world even knew they happened. But for the men on the boats, those helicopters were everything. Angels with machine guns, keeping death at bay, one mission at a time. By 1968, the Brown Water Navy and the Seawolves had perfected their deadly partnership. Together, they made the Mekong Delta one of the most controlled regions in Vietnam. But the cost was steep. Wrecked boats, downed aircraft, and too many names etched into makeshift memorials aboard the motherships. Still, the fight continued. The rivers had become the arteries of a living war, pulsing with noise, courage, and blood. The men who fought there didn't talk about victory. They talked about surviving one more patrol. And as the sun set over the water, the sound of the Hueys faded into the distance, leaving only the slow ripple of the current and the waiting silence that always came before the next fight. The Mekong Delta was a world of contradictions. It could look like paradise, palm trees swaying, rice paddies glittering under the sun, water stretching endlessly toward the horizon. But for the men of the Brown Water Navy, it was a slow, suffocating nightmare. Beauty and death lived side by side. The river gave life to millions and took it away in an instant. Every patrol began the same way. The PBR crews loaded ammo belts, checked radios, cleaned their weapons. Then they waited for the order. Get underway. Engines rumbled to life. Diesel fumes hung in the air. The boat slipped from the mothership and into the brown current. Another day, another patrol. Daylight was dangerous, but night was worse. After sunset, the delta changed. The river grew silent, the villages vanished into shadow, and the darkness pressed in from every direction. The men relied on instinct, the faint hum of the engine, the glint of a ripple, the rhythm of the current. Some nights the water was calm. Other nights it was chaos. Gunfire could erupt from nowhere. Mines could detonate under the hull, and in seconds a peaceful patrol turned into a firefight. The enemy wasn't the only threat. Nature itself seemed determined to break them. The heat was relentless, thick, humid, and inescapable. The air felt heavy enough to breathe. Sweat soaked uniforms within minutes. Mosquitoes swarmed so thick they looked like smoke. The men coated themselves in repellent that never worked. Even when it rained, the heat didn't ease. It only trapped the steam closer to the skin. Then there was the water, their constant companion and their worst enemy. The Mekong was a living thing. It carried mud, trash, and sometimes bodies. It infected cuts within hours. Men who fell overboard risked leeches, parasites, and disease. Drinking water was scarce. Everything, clothes, boots, weapons, stayed wet. Mould grew on rifles. Bread went stale in a day. Even sleep was damp. Each sailor developed rituals to survive. Some tied talismans to their boats. Others carried small photos of home sealed in plastic. Superstition ran deep on the river. When every bend could hide death, luck mattered as much as skill. Life aboard the PBR was cramped. 4 men shared a space barely larger than a pickup truck. They slept in shifts, ate cold rations, and joked about everything because laughter was the only thing that made the fear tolerable. Letters from home arrived soaked, smudged, sometimes months late. They read them anyway, again and again, until the paper nearly fell apart. The bond between crewmen was unbreakable. They fought together, slept inches apart, and trusted each other completely. Out there, rank mattered less than instinct. The boat captain might be 19, the gunner only 18. They weren't just a crew, they were family. If one man fell, the others would risk everything to bring him back. Sometimes that meant diving into burning water to pull a wounded friend from a sinking boat. Sometimes it meant standing exposed behind the twin 50s to lay down covering fire while medics worked. They didn't think about medals or orders, they just did it. Because on the Delta, hesitation killed faster than bullets. And when someone didn't make it, the grief came quietly. There were no funerals on the river, The patrol would end, the engines would go silent, and the surviving crew would gather on deck. A few words, maybe a moment of silence. Then the next mission began. The war didn't stop for anyone. For all the danger, there were strange moments of peace. Dawn on the river after a long night of fighting. Children waving from the banks. A local fisherman offering a smile or a piece of fruit. The men learned to cling to those moments, brief reminders that the world still had gentleness left in it. But the Delta always took more than it gave. Mines, ambushes, disease, they became part of daily life. By the late years of the war, thousands of sailors had served in the Brown Water Navy. Many came home scarred, some didn't come home at all. The river marked them all in some way. They had entered the Delta as sailors. They left as survivors. Men who had stared into the swamp's dark mirror and seen what war really looked like, close, personal and unforgiving. One veteran later said, "You didn't fight the river. You just tried to stay alive long enough to get out of it." For the men who lived those days, the Mekong wasn't just a place. It was a memory that never left. The hum of engines, the taste of salt and diesel, the smell of rain and gunpowder, the sound of friends laughing in the dark. And even years later, when the war was over, many still dreamed of that endless muddy water, carrying ghosts downstream, back toward the sea. When the last patrols ended, the rivers of Vietnam went quiet again. The gunfire faded, the flares stopped rising, and the muddy waters returned to their ancient rhythm. Villagers came back to rebuild what the war had taken. The boats that once carried sailors into battle were hauled onto riverbanks and left to rust in the sun. The Mekong Delta, scarred but still alive, carried on as it always had. But for the men who had fought there, the war on the rivers never truly ended. It stayed with them, in dreams, in the smell of diesel, in the sound of a motor cutting through still water. The Brown Water Navy had been a small part of the war in Vietnam, yet its legacy reached far beyond those narrow canals. Operation Game Warden began as an experiment, a desperate attempt to control the waterways. What it created was something entirely new, a modern riverine fighting force, able to operate in shallow water, coordinate with air support, and strike with precision. The Navy had rediscovered an old truth, that control of the rivers could shape the course of a war just as much as control of the sea. Out of the Mekong came new tactics, new technologies, and a new understanding of warfare. The PBRs, the gunboats, and the SEAL teams proved that mobility and speed could win battles even in the most unpredictable terrain. The coordination between the river patrols and the Seawolves became a blueprint for future joint operations, air, land, and sea working as one. When the war ended, many thought the Brown Water Navy would disappear, its purpose gone with the Mekong. But its lessons lived on. In the decades that followed, the US Navy formed permanent riverine squadrons, trained specifically for shallow water combat. Those units would later deploy to Iraq's Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and even to coastal regions in Africa and the Middle East. They carried the same mindset: small crews, fast boats, tight coordination, and absolute trust between men. The technology changed. The boats became faster, armoured, and equipped with advanced sensors. The helicopters evolved into sleek attack craft with guided rockets and thermal imaging. But the soul of the Brown Water Navy, the courage to face an invisible enemy on shifting ground, stayed the same. The men who served in the Delta were often forgotten at first. The Vietnam War was long, painful, and controversial, and their story was buried under larger headlines. They weren't fighter pilots or carrier captains. They were sailors who fought in silence, waist deep in the mud, in places maps could barely name. But over time, historians began to recognise their impact. Their patrols denied the Viet Cong critical supply routes, disrupted operations, and forced the enemy to fight on American terms. Without them, control of southern Vietnam might have collapsed far sooner. Many of those men never sought recognition. They came home quietly, went back to their lives, and carried their memories in private. But among themselves, they stayed connected. Reunions, letters, calls, a bond stronger than distance or years. When they spoke of the Delta, it was never about victory or politics. It was about the men beside them, the nights that seemed endless, and the moments when courage meant simply keeping the boat steady under fire. One veteran once said, "We didn't fight for the river. We fought for each other." The river was just where we happen to be today. The legacy of the Brown Water Navy lives on in the men and women who serve in the Navy's modern riverine and coastal units. Their insignia carries a small reminder, crossed anchors over a riverboat silhouette, a tribute to those who turned the Mekong into a battlefield. Museums display the old PBRS, their hulls scarred by bullet holes, their decks still smelling faintly of oil and sweat. Tourists walk past them, unaware that each scratch, each dent, tells a story written in fire and fear. The Mekong itself remains unchanged. The same muddy waters still flow through the same twisting channels. Fishermen still cast their nets where sailors once fought for their lives. The river forgets, but the men who served there never do. In the end, the Brown Water Navy didn't win the war in Vietnam, but it proved something enduring, that even in the most impossible environments, courage, skill, and brotherhood could carve victory from chaos. They took a vast ocean fleet and reshaped it for the smallest of wars, fought in the narrowest of places. They turned a river into a battlefield, and in doing so changed naval warfare forever. When the sun sets over the Mekong today, the water glows the same deep gold it did half a century ago. Somewhere in that fading light, if you listen closely, you might still hear it. The faint echo of engines, the rattle of machine guns, and the ghosts of the men who once ruled the brown water. They were sailors who became warriors, and their story flows on, carried forever by the river. If you made it this far, thank you for walking this road with us. If you love stories like this, true stories about courage, endurance, and forgotten history, make sure to subscribe, hit like, and tap the hype button so more people can discover them too. Until next time, keep your head low, your spirit high, and remember the trail that refused to die.